So this is a different kind of video for me. I already recorded this, and this was part of my getting my Sketchup file into Blender and then into Inkscape. Now, the issue is SketchUp's export to SVG or vector formats is actually embedded into their layout application. Now, when you download SketchUp, if you're still downloading SketchUp, you can use it online. But if you still download it as a full application and you paid for it, you get an additional application called Layout, which is their basically a methodology for taking your 3D models, your architectural models, and making blueprints. It has a lot of tools, and one of them in particular is the export to the 2D format of SVG. Now, I had already had the plugin to flatten my models, and I had planned on just exporting a reasonably high resolution bitmap from SketchUp and then doing my diagrams and coloring from there. But in planning to have this output to a 3D printing, or excuse me, a 2D laser cutting service, one which would cut, score, and perforate the model as needed, you have to have an SVG, a DXF, or one of those files that layout exports naturally, or it exports it natively. So the alternative to that was an interesting plugin in Blender. And Blender comes with, I believe, now comes with this plugin for free, and it's called Freestyle. And what it is, what it does is, of course, it exports SVG, and it exports vector formats, which you can see here. I'm loading the plugin using some materials to define things, but the Freestyle plugin is just a rendering plugin for exporting an SVG file, excuse me, a vector graphics file. And it does that, from any view. People have been using it to render stylized illustrations. But what I needed was, of course, the entire model from SketchUp exported in a vector format. So it did that easily enough. But one of the things you have to watch out for is when you're exporting a vector format to a laser cutting service, they're going to require that different line weights or different line colors exported in that SVG are going to do different things according to the laser cutting. In other words, the laser knows from the color of the line, whether it's a dotted line, that it'll do different things. Let's say the laser cutting service that I was going to go with actually wanted, or actually could do perforations. And of course, you would expect that perforation to be a dotted line. Well, I need to get a consistent line around everything that needs to be perforated. So in order to define that in Blender, you can see that I'm making these blue patches of everything. And those are separate materials that the Freestyle plugin is going to understand have different properties. And among those properties are whether or not the entire object is an outline, or whether the interior definition of materials requires, like you can see here in the Inkscape file, that the lighter gauge of lines, the lighter line weight of lines, are actually defined by those materials when they're being exported. So that was easy enough. I got a few tests that you saw there of the entire model in Inkscape, exported from Blender with these material definitions. Now I had to do this multiple times because in just looking at the model and gauging, I've built a bunch of these before as in my background as an advertising specialties designer. I've built a lot of these before, and you can kind of tell that certain objects are going to need more tabs or fewer tabs, larger tabs for gluing and assembly, which is what those pointed shapes are, which are, well, a lot of those little beveled rectangles are. They're for gluing the model together. And of course, a lot of these things, you look at them, okay, this object was shaped wrong. Like you can see the head there was a little oblong. I had to correct that. So I had to go back to SketchUp, re-flatten the model, and then re-export everything all the way down the line. And that sounds like a really complicated workflow. But just remember this, SketchUp, I believe, still costs up to about if they haven't switched to the subscription model, it costs like $500. I remember, I think at one time it cost $750. So these are all between Blender, Inkscape, and SketchUp, the free version of SketchUp. There's no cost here. There's absolutely no investment except that in time. And I've got a reasonable amount of practice and time in with all of these programs, and this really was less than an afternoon. I'm estimating it took me from lunchtime to about mid-afternoon to do all of this and while I was working, I was capturing everything. So that's a reasonable investment, I think. So towards the end of this, I'm going to show you the final Inkscape file, which is I took the export from Blender, the final vector file, and that layout isn't conducive to what the laser cutting service is going to require. They have particular size requirements, and one of them is that the border around your document has to support the area with which the machines and tools it's basically a printing bed. It has to support the width with which the paper is held onto something and then it's cut. It doesn't sit there on the bed. It's secured so it doesn't blow around. It's secured in other ways. I think some people have actually created vacuum beds so that smaller pieces get sucked out or stay where they are without using adhesive. And that's the final layout that I came up with. So it's supposed to fit on one sheet or two sheets of paper in the end. I think I'm going to go with, judging by the size of the cuts and gluing requirements for the model. But, I'm getting there. So I'll see you next time.